Let's talk about grief today. We are taught to solve for X in algebra, but we are never taught how to solve for the hole that's left behind when a version of our lives die. In school, we prioritize output and logic, but as you start growing up and as you start living, and I feel like part of the reason why we are struggling so much right now is because as you start living, you realize that life demands integration and loss. And the unprocessed grief determines who you become. And as a Black woman, an immigrant woman, someone who grew up in a low income neighborhood, who grew up to parents who had their own griefs that they're struggling through, I inherited grief that they may have never had permission to name or um, didn't even know they could name it. I think that so much of the divide between our generation and our parents' generation, and I'm a millennial, um, and I would say my parents are boomers or Gen Xers. I don't know. They're 60 plus. um, and I think their generation and also just what was happening was that they had to survive, right? And they also came from cultures. Like I said, I'm African, so they came from cultures that were really deeply entrenched in just going along to get along and respect, which means that the harms, the grief, the generational, whatever that were formed or was formed, even if it didn't feel great, it was normalized, right? So then it passed down in silence and resentment and other things, um, and therefore people weren't allowed to process. The grief ended up hijacking and taking over their lives, really and truly. So I just want to just talk about grief today. I want to talk about how so often when we talk about grief, we are talking about maybe someone physically dying, and there's a lot around the grief of that. And lately, we've been talking a lot more around the grief of friendships. But I also want to talk about the grief of careers, the grief of the life that you thought you were going to live, that you are actually not living, right? Because we have daily griefs, whether that's losing the job, losing a friendship, the shifting of your body, the loss of what could have been. And it's really about a story ending. It's about what you thought was going to last, what you thought something was going to be, what you imagined, what you dreamed about, not coming to fruition or coming to fruition in a way that you did not expect. And that really hurts. But it all starts with our family. And I was just watching this episode, the Mel Robbins podcast. She interviewed Dr. Bouquet, and she explains the idea of the false family. And it's that many of us spend years grieving a fantasy version of our parents um, or a life that never existed. We have to allow ourselves to attend funerals. And a few years back, I don't know if it was popular, but one of my favorite creators, Rosemary on TikTok, did this funeral to her single life, right? And as she was transitioning from being single, living by herself, and then moving to live with her boyfriend, she did a funeral to her singleness. And I really appreciate that because ultimately, is it comedic in a way? Yes, but it's also truth to that. And when you move from space to space, I think we have lost the idea of rituals, and we need to bring more rituals into our lives. We blend so much these days, I think, because of social media and how fast we're moving, that you go from being a child to an adult to a teenager. Like, you're just blending so much and you're blending so many emotions and so many milestones, and we no longer have rituals. And I think it's valid to have funerals, to have celebrations, to have something. And in this instance, we're talking about grief, but to have something that marks like, hey, this is not what I thought it would be. It's not what I wished we had. And therefore, then you can start admitting what you do have. Because we talk a lot about breaking generational curses, and it's kind of warped around, self-help. But I want us to explore what it means to actually be a cycle breaker, what it means to walk into spaces and say, hey, this doesn't feel right. And I know it didn't feel right for you either. And I'll speak for my family. I know there's so many things that my mom used to complain about and say about my grandma and like and you know things that were done and said or not said. But then all that resulted in was like grumbling to me or to other people, but to my grandmother, everything was all good. And I deeply, deeply did not like that. And it's something that like has probably shaped a huge part of who I am. I'm like, no, if you don't like something, you don't like someone, whatever the case might be, have a conversation about it. But there's just no way that I'm gonna not like you and still engage with you on a friendly basis just off the strength of culture. And if you, at some point too, I think as we grow up, we realize that people won't change, then just allow that. Just allow that non-change and say, hey, this person is not going to change, and that's okay. Grieve who you wanted them to be, accept that, and then move on. I don't know. I think is that fair? Because once you move on from who you thought they would be, maybe it opens up space for who they are. And I think that's important. So I think that once we start doing that and once we start accepting and grieving within our first structures, which is our family structures, and whatever customs and cultures are around that, then we are also then allowed to learn how to grieve other things. And I talk a lot about careers, and I talk about how often I pivot. And I also talk about how the future of work is so perilous because of AI and the global economy and all this stuff. And I think the people who are going to struggle the most are the people who don't fully understand or who don't lean into grieving. Because when you don't grieve, the title, the job, where you thought you would be, like all these things that we attach to our careers, if you don't allow yourself to grieve that, then I think what happens is that it makes it really hard to accept the reality of where we are and then adjust to the system. And when I say adjust to the system, it doesn't mean you need to believe in the system or believe in whatever, but it allows you to see the game that's being played and move ahead. But if you never grieve it, then you kind of remain stuck. And I think that's where people come and start talking about applying so much and not wanting to do this and not wanting to do that, but then they're not getting what they want. And I think it's grieving the old system. If the old system said you apply for a job online and 2 days later you get a call and that's no longer the system, grieve that and then move forward. If the system said you needed to do, I'm not going to edit that out. I'm just going to keep it in because I don't want to edit this video. Um, what was I saying? Oh my gosh. I have to edit this video now. I think sometimes we um I think sometimes we I think with careers, we don't allow ourselves to grieve what actually is happening. Whether that's the responsibilities of what you need to do in the job, whether that's the reality of, hey, a degree will no longer um equate, a degree will no longer equate to you get a job automatically. Your years of experience does not mean that you're the preferred choice. I think once we grieve that, it doesn't grieving, I think, opens up acceptance of this is the reality we're in. And once you are able to sit in the reality, you may not like it. It may not be your philosophy. So I'm not saying like you need to, be a champion of it. But once you grieve it, then you're able to move on and say, okay, now that I understand the reality, what can I do next? Right. I think that's really, really important, especially in careers and how quickly things are moving. So with that, this is where um, I see a lot of people struggling. And it's not because people lack talent. It's not because people are still grieving the version of the career they thought. And this is why I see a lot of people are struggling in their careers, not because people don't have talents, people don't have experience, people don't have a lot to offer the marketplace, but because folks are still grieving the version of the career they thought they would have, or maybe they haven't even started the grieving process. They're still holding on to it so tightly. They haven't realized that it's lost. So people are holding on to stories that don't serve who you actually want to be and who you could be. So if you're ready to let go of those stories that keep you playing small, and you're ready to grieve uh, grieve the current state or what you've lost, right? That's what I do. That's the work we do in the clarity calls. And in there, we spend 60 minutes untangling the cycle, recognizing the expertise you're already carrying, and deciding your inheritance doesn't have to be your old identity. Every day is an opportunity to break a cycle. Every day is an opportunity to hold a grieving ritual. And once you do that, it's an opportunity to get at the life that you want. And you can start today. So I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Subscribe for more.